Hi, everybody. This is Lowell, and I'm talking about music theory again, and we're discussing harmony. I'm kind of wrapping this back around full circle. What I've talked about in the past several, actually from the beginning of this series, is starting with an understanding of what melody is, and then going into rhythm, and then finishing with harmony. And I started with this discussion of melody as being linear and a linear understanding of music. And I talked a lot about Bach. Bach was, in my estimation, the foundation of all of Western art music. There was much that happened before him, but several things happened when Bach lived, and what he did with the changes in music set him up to be basically the foundation point for, in my opinion, of Western art music. And what happened was you have the advent of what's called equal temperament, and we talked about equal temperament and what that did. And so Bach thought linearly. He did think harmonically, but he thought predominantly linearly. And so composers since Bach would take some of the ideas and the thoughts that he created. And one of the things that really set Bach apart from all composers and all the composers, great composers after him who studied his works, would use these techniques, and it was a technique that's referred to motivic development. And motivic development would take a line or a fragment, and I've used the Beethoven opening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. That those four notes, very simplistic four notes, end up becoming the melody for the next phrase, and then really, arguably, you could say that the entire symphony was derived from those opening four notes, that the seed idea. And so that's motivic development. And so composers throughout history, since Bach on into the 20th century, modern composers took equal temperament and motivic development very to the extreme, even though they all thought harmonically, but they took it to an extreme to where harmony began to become so chromatic that you would start in one key and end in another key. It wasn't clear what key you're in. The amount of chromaticism that existed in the late 1800s into the early 1900s was very rich and very beautiful. Then a theory teacher in Vienna named Arnold Schoenberg decided to basically analyze all the chromaticism, and he pushed his analysis to a new type of composition, which we call serialism. And serialism, my understanding is that Schoenberg originally called this pantonality. In other words, each note was its own tonal center, and we've since then termed it atonal. In other words, there is no tonal center. And so in the early 1900s, basically our understanding of harmony began to break apart from Bach all the way to that point. And it was essentially built on equal temperament. And so what Schoenberg created was this use of motivic development to the maximum amount of chromaticism that you could have. And so he created this rule, essentially, that you could not, you would create a melody, you would create a fragment, much going back to Beethoven's Fifth, Beethoven's Fifth opening was four notes. It was really just two notes, bum, 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 bum. And so that was, the fragment that Beethoven used to create from. But in Schoenberg's idea of a new way of composing, or basically the historically relevant, what had been evolved into way of composing, of taking that same idea, is that you would use all 12 notes to create, and you could not use another. you could not use a note that hadn't been used already. If you've used a note, then you couldn't use it again. And so then you would take that and show all the different iterations of what that fragment could be, and essentially all the different transpositions of that. You know, if you had a melody that started on C and you use all the 12 notes, and then, well, what's the next transposition of that? And so then you could do all of those backwards, which is called retrograde, and you could do all of them basically flipping the intervals, which is called inversion. And so he created essentially this chart. It's called a matrix that you could show all the various iterations of a 12-note melody. And so here's a little 12-note melody that I created that could be, used for a composition in serialism. And it goes like this. And so I used all 12 notes. So what basically, if you call C, and it could be any note, but just for the sake of explaining, I've used middle C as the starting point, and so I'm calling that 1. Here's 1, and then here's 3, or here's 4 rather. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then here's 2, from the C is 1, 2, and then here's, I'm calling this 3, which is the D, 1, 2, 3. And so it's all based upon the root note. I'm calling 1, but in a 12-tone matrix, they actually call 1 as 0. And so we would, call this line by their numbers. We would call it 0, 3, 1, 2, 9, 11, 8, 7, 10, 6, 5, 4. And there's a little chart here. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a resource online that shows how you just put you type in your melody or the 12-tone row and up at the top line, and then it calculates all these different iterations of that melody. And so if you look at this chart, then all the different ways that you can invert it are, you could read the chart this way, and then all the transpositions in all the different like instead of starting with C, I could start with D, or I could start with E, but it's the same pattern. And so those are called primes, the original melody, and you would read the primes this way, all the lines that are going that way. And then if you wanted to do all those melodies backwards, which is called retrograde, you would read them starting this way. And then the retrograde inversions, which is upside down and backwards, you would read it this way. And so that same, this same chart right here would be used to compose from. And so you would find areas, if you wanted to write harmonically from this, then you would find areas in this tone row that could be used harmonically. And you could create a tone row that basically is harmonic sounding. I did sort of a chromatic line, but you could do something like this. I don't know, I forgot which notes I was doing, but you could create various triads out of that. Let's see here. Yeah. Well, you couldn't do that. You could do similar things where you're not using any of the notes again in the same tone row. And so that was kind of like a way of of accentuating motivic development. It's like, well, why did they have to put all these restrictions and rules upon themselves? And so I think that the main idea behind all of this was to accentuate motivic development and pattern usage. And as I've said, or in other videos, our brains think in patterns, and when we perceive and see things, we see things in patterns and relationship. And with music, the more patterned that you can be, and the more understandably that patterns can be assimilated as you're hearing things, it creates a sense of meaning, as you're hearing it. And so that was what serialists in the mid 20th century were striving to do, is to create pattern awareness. There were other people that came after Schoenberg. He was the first person to bring this system into existence, and then his main students were Anton Webern, Alban Berg, and later, Pierre, what's his name? Pierre Boulez took these same ideas and really maximized it into the 21st century. And Pierre Boulez was studying to try to understand how linguistics tie into music in terms of consonants and vowels and meaning and all sorts of different shades of meaning based upon accents. And so what composers on up to Pierre Boulez, who died in the early part of the 21st century, he was striving not only to what they call serialize pitches, but he was trying to serialize all sorts of elements of music, such as dynamics, or just anything you can think of in terms of music creation. He was serializing it, and creating basically almost scientific patterns that would hopefully be recognized by the human ear. But and this is my own conviction as a composer, and there are a lot of people that would vehemently disagree with me, but this is my video, so I get to say what I want. So anyway, my point of view is that all of this is, this theoretical is fine and good, but it lost value when essentially when equal temperament basically outgrew its usefulness historically. And so I know that everything that we hear in music these days is based on equal temperament. And I did a video of this earlier, but equal temperament, in my opinion, fulfilled its usefulness in the early part of the 20th century. And when people started going to this serialist technique, I have since, in my own studies, developed a way to incorporate serialism in a way that actually has harmonic grounding in the use of the overtone series. And so if you want to study further, some of these thoughts and actually the history of how I came to believe this, I'll put the link down below. But I call it integrated frequency. And so there is a way that you can use that you can use serialism in a way that is pinned to tonal foundations. But it requires that we use a different tuning system. And we're going to be talking about, in the next video, we're going to be talking about tuning systems and ambient sounds and the things that have developed since the 20th century on up to our 21st century now, musically. So this is, and to kind of summarize what I'm trying to say here, the beginnings of music theory, in my estimation, with Bach, and he initialized a way of composing that was unique and new, based upon a new tuning system. and that was great, and it lasted several hundred years. And now here we are in the 20th century, and we're trying to understand what music should look like compositionally. And I believe that there's a new way of moving forward, and composers have been searching and kind of hinting at this for the really throughout the 20th century. And I believe that I have found a way forward that we can use that still requires a lot of development and some software that could be developed to um, help composers go there. But anyway, this is a discussion of what serialism did, and it was like so many composers, even Stravinsky, who composed beautifully in chromatic romanticism. It still was contemporary and 20th century sounding music, like the Firebird Suite. But just from the Firebird Suite, and then a later, like just a year or two later, he wrote The Rite of Spring, which was just an entirely different framework. And then later on, Stravinsky in the middle of the 20th century wrote with serialism the Rake's Progress, and so that was totally serialized. And but he still sounded like Stravinsky. Um, the last thing I'm going to say about serialism, if serialism is not used in a way that actually is pinned to harmony, to harmonic foundations, then in my estimation, it has also lost its meaning. It does not it is not pleasing. It's been audiences throughout Western the Western world have essentially said, no, this just sounds bad. We know you as composers like this, but it 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 doesn't work in terms of the way that we hear music. We do hear music harmonically. We do, all of nature is based upon the overtone series. All of nature is based upon some degree of harmony, and the fact that serialism used the equal temperament system. The equal temperament system essentially is a non-harmonic system. It is meant to be. It was meant to basically. It came into being so that composers could jump from key center to key center, but we are now in need of a new tuning system in order to have harmonic pinnings and a sense of wholeness and truthfulness and beauty, even when we can use serialist techniques.